Good morning, friends. It is, thank you. I just wanted to survey this. This is truly an honor for me to be here, to be worshiping with this community of faith, and to be a part of this very special day for my friend. So when Pastor Ben asked if I would preach the same sermon for both services, I gladly agreed, because you all will be a part of that. You all will be a part of the ordination process and the call process and the installation of Lauren, though you may not physically be there. So I feel it's right that we have the same sermon. Our text this morning is a familiar one for most of us. It is the opening lines of Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, commonly referred to as the Beatitudes. And through its poetic beauty and seeming simplicity, Jesus reorders the world and its structures and systems while encouraging his followers to gauge in life in the present as though the kingdom of heaven is near. It is as if Jesus wanted the hearers of these words to know what it is like to live in the kingdom of heaven before he went into greater detail about what it's required to live as a follower. So hear now these familiar words from the Gospel of Matthew. I will be reading chapter 5, verses 1 to 12. You may follow along in your Pew Bible on page 785. Hear now a word from God. When Jesus saw the crowds, he went up onto the mountain, and after he sat down and his disciples came to him, he began to speak and taught them, saying, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they will receive mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, and for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when people revile and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven. For in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you." Friends, this is the word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. I entitled this sermon, Energy, Intelligence, Imagination, and Love, for a number of reasons. The first will become obvious during the ordination service when Lauren is asked the constitutional questions that is asked of all who enter into the ordained office. In the penultimate question, we find, will you pray for and seek to serve the people with energy, intelligence, imagination, and love? The answer to this question is, of course, I will with God's help. But when I hear those words, energy, intelligence, imagination, and love, my attention is grabbed. They're evocative for me. They call forth such a wide array of possibilities of what ministry could look like. And they highlight the presence of each of those four attributes in each and every one of us in the unique and wonderful ways they are expressed. Because that is what is required as one fulfills our specific callings. It is this idea of calling, both our common calling as those who are claimed by God and sent into the world as God's agents of the redemptive love initiated by Jesus, and our specific calling, those various places in which we live out this redemptive work. that I believe our text this morning is inviting us to step into and to live as though the kingdom of heaven is near. This concept of the kingdom of heaven is important to note at the outset because it runs throughout Matthew's gospel. The gospel writer plays with this idea of heaven as not just some distant place or some long-awaited for future, though there are elements of that latter one. No, the gospel writer connects it to the proclamation of Jesus. In the person of Jesus, the kingdom of heaven has drawn near. And the boundaries between get blurred as Jesus walks and teaches and heals. In these opening verses of Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, which are typically understood as the preamble to the larger sermon, we hear the Christ setting the tone for what will follow. He has just begun his earthly ministry. He has already begun to heal. He has already called fishermen to be disciples. Crowds have already started to gather around this curious prophet with questions, wondering and hoping to catch and see something miraculous that they've heard is occurring near this guy. And so, noticing the crowds, he goes up on a mountain, reminiscent of Moses, and offers this, his first of 5 sermons that appear in the gospel. And he begins to blur the lines. The kingdom of heaven is like this. By starting with the Beatitudes, Jesus is disorienting and dislocating us from the present ordering of things, subverting the dynamics of power in our world. And as one of my professors, Stan Saunders, notes, the importance of this disordering and dislocating aspect is because it is rooted in a radically different perception of the world. Dr. Saunders continues, the myth that moderns live by, derived from the perception of a broken and hostile creation and a distant and angry God, and thus give rise to greed, alienation, and violence. They teach, those myths that we've been taught, that this is just the way the world is. The Beatitudes take on a different world, with different assumptions, values, and practices. At the heart of these different assumptions, values, and practices is the claim of abundant love emanating from the God who formed and created each and every one of us. It is this God who draws near and invites us to live differently, to live as though God's kingdom is here, trusting in those promises. So what then does it look like to live under these different assumptions, values, and practices? In a sermon on this text, the late professor and Presbyterian lay minister Jorge Lara Brood sought to wonder more broadly on this idea of living the Beatitudes. In his reflecting on this text, Lara Brood translated the Latin word beatitude into his native Spanish. And what he found was that the Spanish word literally translates to good adventure to you. This sense of summons to life in Jesus' words were given deeper meaning with this translation for Lara Brood. This then turned him to reflect on the life of his friend, the martyr and Archbishop of San Salvador, Oscar Romero. In Romero, Lara Brood notes, he saw someone who lived the good adventure of the life of faith as he cared for the poor, confronted those whose hearts were heavy with grief, who spoke out about injustices he saw, fought fearlessly to quell the violence that plagued his beloved El Salvador, spoke rebuke to those in power, implored those who had means to resist. These acts were done as somebody who had never been so much in love with life, Laura Brood remembers. Yet Romero died a martyr's death behind the communion table, blessing the Eucharist. In living the good adventure of the life of faith, we will find ourselves standing between two kingdoms, between two worlds, and thus the blessings proclaimed becomes both an invitation to live and a hoped-for promise. For there are those who are poor in spirit, who hope in the face of injustice and crushing circumstances and are made vulnerable, who mourn and whose spirits are downcast because of loss, alienation, separation, lamentation, and grief, who are meek, trusting in God's divine promises to restore the brokenness in their lives, who hunger and thirst for righteousness because their hearts ache at the sight of the brokenness in our world, and seek to enter places like this, casting light and hope, who are merciful, whose acts of compassion create space for those who have been excluded or looked over, who are pure in heart, living lives that resist self-serving acts in favor of care, who are peacemakers, whose acts of love transgress the lines of friend and foe, those we agree with and those whose views we may find repugnant, who are persecuted for righteousness' sake. With every effort, they seek to be in relationships that undermine the structures of class, race, gender identity, sexual orientation, political view, and even religion. There are those who are reviled and persecuted and have evil uttered falsely against them in the name of Christ, for their actions conform to that of the prophets. And they are called to rejoice and be glad, for they are doing the work of God. For all of these will be the kingdom of heaven, the promise of comfort, of inheritance, of filled cups, of the enveloping of mercy, beholding the presence of God, being called God's children, and knowing that their work has revealed God's power and presence. And so if we read the Beatitudes as being both an eschatologic blessing and an invitation to live in the world as though the kingdom of heaven is actually near, and the good adventure of the life of faith is our calling, how then will we respond? This brings me back to that ordination question. Will you pray for and seek to serve the people with energy, intelligence, imagination, and love? For I believe to fulfill our calling, both our common calling and our particular calling will require us to use our energy, intelligence, imagination, and love to respond and live as though the kingdom of heaven is truly near. For this demands our whole being, not just the innate skills and talents that we possess and have cultivated, but will require all of us. Every aspect of who we are. It is an all-encompassing, transformative, life-giving, and ever-unfolding calling. It is a process in which we will be called deeper into love of God, neighbor, and ourself. We will be using our imaginations to see possibility, beauty, hope, and life where all signs seem counter. It will call for a broadening of our horizons, of our intelligence, moving us closer towards wisdom, while ever renewing our energies to serve in sacred acts of kindness, justice, mercy, and love to our God, our neighbor, and ourselves. For later, when we ask Lauren this question, we not only are looking for her answer, but we're looking for yours as well. For the concerns of this world are great and too numerous to name at this point, which I fear has the possibility of pushing them further away. But yet, around every corner, and maybe even in our own hearts, we will find those in need. We will find those who are longing for a word of hope, who seek restoration of broken relationships, who find themselves in deep darkness, aching for light to guide them out. For those who desire space to be made for them at the table, at this table, and at the tables we gather around. For those, we will find those in our work who are working for the betterment of others and are looking for friends to join them to help build bridges that span the chasms that seemingly divide us, who seek to engage in honest relationships with those who are different from themselves, and those who find themselves in the difficult position of calling out injustice and hatred. They're looking for us to join them. And so as we wait for the consummation of all things, when the kingdom of heaven comes and transforms our world, restoring it back to the place of beauty and delight, where God is fully present to us, and these promised blessings are fulfilled, we are called to live differently. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. And so, until then, we are invited to live the life of the Beatitudes, a life that goes beyond for a future hoped blessing, but into the life of good adventure, a life in which has been reoriented, a life that is guided by the assumptions, values, and practices of the kingdom of heaven, a life that trusts in the promises that lead us to engage with courage, refuse to play it safe, and where our energy, intelligence, imagination, and love is engaged in the service of our own particular calling, again and again and again, in our acts that are both large and small. For we have been told what is good and what the Lord requires of each of us, but to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with our God. Hallelujah and amen.